Hi everyone, I am recording the last video lecture for our October term English 123 class. It's kind of bittersweet, but as promised, I am doing a video lecture on the problem solution paper. Many of you volunteered your papers, your drafts, which was awesome, but it was a first come, first served opportunity. So I did take the first one that was volunteered to me. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the classical argument paper. I'm going to go through the student's paper and kind of take you through my process of what I'm looking for, what you should be doing, and make some comments, do some show kind of revision and process, that type of thing. So the problem solution paper, so like I said in the announcement that I posted today, the final things you're doing for this class include this, you guys have submitted the drafts of the problem solution paper, and I'm giving some feedback on that, and I'm halfway through giving feedback on that, so I have 7 left to do right now, and I do it alphabetically, so I always apologize for those people who are later in the alphabet because you get your feedback a little later than other people. But you have the problem solution paper and then the final exam for this class. So those are the final things, and everything is due at the end of this module week. So that's December 16th by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then that marks the very end of this course. And then I submit grades a week later. So I try to put all the grades in at least like a day or two before I submit them to Embry-Riddle. And then I'll let you know. I'll send an announcement that says I've input all of the grades into Canvas. Please go in and look, and then let me know if you have any questions or concerns. And then if you do, contact me, and then just to do that before I submit them to Embry-Riddle. Okay. So this is the problem solution paper. It's sort of similar to the classical argument, but it's asking for some different things. And the instructions give a nice organization to use for the problem solution paper. So you really just kind of want to stick to that and just use this as a guiding beacon, right? So you have A and B is your introduction, and then the problem should obviously be in the introduction where you define the problem and talk about it and establish it, and then using evidence to establish it in the introduction. But then you kind of want to develop that, and so you might want to spend a short paragraph after the introduction further defining the problem, explaining what needs solving, and then go into a paragraph that details potential solutions. And this is kind of like what is already in place, what are solutions that have already been attempted, or what are solutions that haven't been attempted that you think might be good solutions. And then and this, where you select the best solution, this can happen where you talk about potential solutions, or the best solution can be its own paragraph. It just depends on how much you have to say about the potential solutions. And then I would definitely refute possible objections in its own paragraph. And then you want your conclusion to be this call to action. So you don't just want to summarize everything that you do up here. Then it has to be like a call to action. Great, you've given the best solution. Now what needs to happen? So it's kind of like almost the logistics or a schematic of this is the best solution. In order to help actualize this best solution, these are the things that need to happen, right? A, B, C, however many things. Okay. And you're all doing, the APA has greatly improved throughout the course, so I want you guys to pat yourselves on the back for that. APA is not the easiest thing, but I'm noticing it's much better in the problem solution paper than it has been in the past. And that's because we haven't done a whole lot of APA in the class, right? The beginning of the class was spent on more informal writing assignments, and then the course is what we call backloaded. You can front load a course and backload a course. This course is backloaded with more formal assignments, right, with the classical argument and the problem solution paper. Okay, so I'm going to go into the students' papers, and right away I'm seeing that their APA looks good, the font looks good, the running header is good, this is what it should look like. They have the 3 lines here, which is good, which is the title, the student's name, which I've taken out for anonymity, and then the institution. In this case, it's Embry-Riddle. And then, right, the second header looks good because running head is not stated here. And they do restate their title. The only difference is that this title is different. Oh, no, they're the same. The military needs to do more to increase mental health support. Nope, they are different titles. So I would recommend the student to, I'm just going to go ahead and insert a note there that says, this title is, and I'm actually just going to make this larger, this title is different from the one on your cover page. So the student just needs to decide which one they like better and then just go with that one. So it's not a big deal. Okay, so this is their introduction. You can see that first full paragraph. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through the whole thing and then provide some notes on it. And I'm going to do the same thing that I've been doing in Canvas, which is, and this is what I stated in the announcement as well, I'll probably do a little bit more in this just to show, but because I want to look at like the rebuttal and the call to action and stuff like that. But I'm going to focus a lot on the introduction and the first body paragraph, and then I'll do a little bit of notes on other things, but I'm not going to focus on that as more. And like I said before, and like what I did in the classical argument video lecture is the notes that are given, particularly in body paragraphs, are usually the same. So if you're doing one thing in one body paragraph, the chances of you doing it in other body paragraphs are the same thing. It's a little bit different for this paper because you're being asked to do rhetorically different things in the different papers, like defining a problem, now, detail the possible solutions, best solutions, objections, that type of stuff. So it's a little different, but ultimately not really in terms of what the structure of a body paragraph should look like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read, and this is about the military needing to increase mental health support services. So I already have an idea. I haven't read this because just like with the classical argument draft lecture, I like to keep my modeling as quote unquote realistic as possible. So the military is the backbone of our nation's defense system. Therefore, we need it to be fully staffed with mentally sound soldiers at all times. In this generation, many can be described as hesitant to join our country's armed forces, more so in comparison to past generations, because of the increased awareness of the implications that military service can have on one's mental health. The most obvious reason that people state that they don't join the military is because of the constant fear of the various dangers associated with being a member of the armed forces. This constant state of alertness and fear over a significant amount of time can lead to breakdowns in the mental health status of enlisted soldiers and officers. While some of these dangers are exaggerated media portrayals, the reality is that the military isn't a totally safe place. A fine, yet often easily unbalanced, state of awareness and preparedness is necessary to execute the job, all while making a conscious effort to protect one's own mental health. Unfortunately, the military does not do enough to make mental health support a priority. Okay, so I have some notes for this introduction. I think my initial response is, I understand the problem. So the problem, right, is that the student is saying that the military, right, does not, especially they reiterated in this last sentence, the military does not do enough to make mental health support a priority. So I can presume they're going to be arguing for solutions to how the military can increase and sustain its focus and resources for mental health for soldiers. And my other initial response to this is that there's no evidence in the introduction. So, as I've said before, introduction is the evidence is one of the best ways to develop your own ethos as a writer. So the student is bringing up good points, and I think the introduction is organized well. So, but there's a few things that I would want clarification on in the introduction so that I'm on the same page as this writer, and making sure that they're doing as much as they can to really establish the problem itself. So, the first thing I'll start off with is the first sentence, because that's what I always do. I think it starts out fine. I would put backbone in quotation marks because this is what we call idiomatic language. And it's okay to use idiomatic language every now and then. I've talked a little bit about it before, but when you use it, you just want to put it in quotation marks so that you're letting the reader know, I know this is idiomatic language, but I want to still use this particular word or phrase. So now if there's another non-idiomatic way to say this, then that would be recommended, although I think this is fine as long as it's in quotation marks. This is coming up green here, and that's because either the comma is not needed at all because it's a comma slice, or 2 commas are needed. And I would recommend the 2 commas there, just so there's a little bit, the therefore, which is a transitional word, is broken off by itself. And I give I'm making a lot of notes about commas in papers to bring people's attention, to let you know you have a lot of work to do with commas. So I've said it before. There's commas are one of the most important meaning-making punctuations in writing, and if you misuse it or don't use it appropriately, meaning can be quickly lost or misconstrued by the reader. So I'm bringing up commas here, no commas here. This needs to be bracketed off in commas. I'm trying to draw your attention to the fact that you need to be aware of this grammatical meaning-making tool. So that's how you would just fix that. The student would fix that here. So we need it to be fully staffed with mentally sound soldiers at all time. So my first question is, and if you watch the classical argument draft video lecture, you may have an inkling as to what I'm about to say, is what does mentally sound mean? So I can infer what it means, but if you ask me what mentally sound means, I don't have an answer for it. So this is a place where a definition is needed, and a definition of either, mental health, or what does it mean to be mentally sound? Because somebody, for example, can, and I'm just, again, this is begging a question. That's a lot of my job is to poke holes. As your teacher, I'm sorry, a part of my job is to poke holes in your logic, to let you know this is where you're slipping a little bit, to try to help you improve, how you approach writing an argument. But if, for example, somebody could have a quote-unquote mental disorder, but take medication and be quote-unquote mentally sound, how do you define a mental disorder? That's the whole other thing. There is the DSM-5, which if we go to, I'm just going to bring it up because I think 5 is the latest. Yeah, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is the American Psychiatric Association. So what they do is they publish this book that's called the DSM, and the DSM-5 is the most recent one. And it basically goes through and identifies when something is officially labeled a mental disorder or not. And so, for example, PTSD is a common mental disorder that's associated with soldiers. So the DSM-5 is going to have a definition on what PTSD is and how to treat it, quote unquote, treat it. So the student, if they don't have information from the DSM in their essay, that would be something I might recommend, is that they go to the DSM and try to pull definitions of, because one of my other notes for the introduction for this paper is what are some of the most common quote unquote mental disorders that soldiers suffer from due to the nature of them being soldiers. The other question that begs is, are we talking about active duty soldiers or are we talking about veterans? So, because that's two totally different worlds. So the student would also want to be specific about that. But the DSM is very controversial because, and it adds things every now and then, and people are always arguing about what it says. So, for example, if, the most common one I can think of is ADD and ADHD. So there's a whole movement of, and not just with ADD and ADHD, but this whole movement of, is that an actual thing? Is ADD an actual thing? Is ADHD an actual thing? Well, the DSM says it is. The DSM identifies it as a mental disorder, which means it's a disease. And, that's a whole other world then once you identify something as a mental disorder, right? You're now subjectively identifying yourself as having a disorder and being a patient and having a problem, which informs how you identify as a human being. So the DSM is very controversial. So even if one were to use, like if this student were to use the definition of PTSD from the DSM, they might disagree with it, depending on what it says. I don't know what the DSM says about PTSD. For example, there's things in the DSM that I disagree with. So they'll argue about, this disorder is this, and I disagree with their definition of what it is. There's things in there that I'm saying that I argue shouldn't be in there. And, why is this considered a mental disorder? I think you're just trying to make stuff up at this point. So it's a highly controversial text, but it's kind of the Oxford English Dictionary high credible level because it's the American Psychiatric Association. If you're ever doing things about mental health, mental disorders, the DSM is the place you want to go. So if we go back to, I know my desktop is scary looking right now. I don't even want to see it. Where's the document? Bring it back. Here it is. Thank goodness. Okay. So what does mentally sound mean? So definition work, done with that. Okay. And then they go on to say in this generation, and I would say what generation? Because that needs more specificity. Many can be described as hesitant to join our country's armed forces, more so. I don't think this is necessary because they say in comparison, so we already have that idea there. In comparison to past generations because of the increased awareness of the implications that military service can have on one's mental health. I need evidence of that. So because what this writer is suggesting is that to some degree there's been this is twofold. because I don't know the answer because the writer hasn't given it to me. So either there's been a decrease in the number of people who have voluntarily joined up for the military. So if we look, say, across 60 years or 50 years, I'm trying to go back to it's hard to take something like Vietnam into effect where people didn't have a choice. But if we think about people who volunteered and who weren't drafted, but the volunteering, people willingly going into the military, if we look at the last 50 years, has there been a decrease in that number? Or is it this idea that there's been some type of cultural movement from people being very excited to join the military due to nationalist interest or for patriotism or this idea of wanting to fight for one's country, and that kind of feeling has somewhat dissipated for some type of cultural reason, and that cultural reason or reasons would need to be identified. So more information is needed here because and this is, the student is offering comparative analysis, right? They're saying this versus this. That comparative analysis is very effective because it helps to elucidate more about your own personal topic for whatever you're arguing. But you do need to make sure that you provide the evidence for what you're comparing it against. Otherwise, the reader doesn't understand the nature of the comparison or the scope of it. Okay, so, and then if we move on, the most obvious reason that people state they don't join the military is because of the constant fear. Again, that needs evidence. Right, so this idea that people don't join because there's a sense of danger and fear with being in the armed forces. So that this is the argue stating, or excuse me, this is the argue. Did I say this is the argue? This is the, I've been grading papers all day, so language is eluding me right now. But evidence is needed here because the writer is making another argument. And again, why? What's causing this people now to not want to be in the armed forces? Is it due to to how war has changed in terms of how countries fight war? Is it are there political reasons behind it? Is it just fear? Is it just fear? When you say constant fear of the various dangers associated with being a member of the armed forces, that's vague and ambiguous language. So this writer needs to be more clear about that. And then the next bit, this constant state of alertness and fear over a significant amount of time can lead to breakdowns in the mental health status of enlisted soldiers and officers. Okay, here the writer is very specific that they're talking about enlisted soldiers and officers. I would just want them to reiterate that in the thesis so reiterate that you are discussing, and I think it's called active duty. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to learn the military language, but and I only have one uncle who was in Vietnam, and my grandfather who's dead was in World War II, and that's it. I don't come from a heavy military family. So reiterate that you are discussing active duty soldiers and if I can spell that right, and officers, because I'm getting the feeling that you differentiate soldiers from officers. So I don't know if it's called active duty officer or just active duty soldiers, or if you use the word enlisted. To the student who's hopefully listening to this, enlisted or active duty, whatever one is used more, because I'm not the expert on that. You probably are in terms of the language. All right. And then here, now my question about this, there was a change in what the writer is doing. So first, the writer is saying before that up here, they're saying the idea is these people who don't join the military. And then it seems to talk about the people who are in the military. So there needs to be some rhetorical work there to make that transition so the writer knows that you're going from, yeah, here I'm talking about people who are too afraid for whatever reasons to enter the military versus, for current enlisted soldiers and officers. And that might even be as simple as just putting this, and it might even be a little bit of a dangling modifier since it's at the end of the sentence following a preposition. But I mean, the writer might say, in the case of enlisted soldiers and officers, this constant state of alertness and fear over a significant amount of time can lead to breakdowns in their mental health status. And I'm just going to leave this here because this has this note here, but the writer can just fix that into being, I would end the sentence there. So that is one way that I might transition that. Okay, and then moving on. While some of these dangers are exaggerated media portrayals, and I'm going to go back to breakdowns in their mental health status because I need more information there. And this goes back to my conversation when I was talking about the DSM. So, are you referring to any specific mental disorders? What do you mean by breakdown in their mental health status? Okay, so that just needs a little bit more information because through this entire introduction, not one mental disorder is discussed. And so they keep talking about mental health support and being mentally sound, but there's no definitions or examples of these types of things. So that's why, and that's not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere in the essay, but it needs to be in the introduction. So the reality is that the military, and I missed a contraction above, but you do want to eliminate contractions. The other one was up here. It would be do not. And that's just because contractions are not considered academic writing. The military is not I might use completely instead of totally, because totally is a little bit colloquial. Okay. A fine, and we don't need commas because you have parentheses. A fine state of awareness, and fine is, again, that word is not clear enough. So, what do you mean by fine? I'm not sure that's the best word to use there. State of awareness and preparedness is necessary to execute the job, all while making a conscious effort to protect one's own mental health. Unfortunately, we need a comma there because unfortunately it's an introductory phrase preceding the grammatical subject, which is the military, does not do enough to make mental health support a priority. So the other thing that's missing from this introduction, and again, even if the writer talks about it in other places in the essay, they still needed to talk about it in the introduction. It doesn't have to be in the thesis. I'm just going to put the note here because it's at the end of the paragraph, is that you don't discuss at all what is the priority of mental health for enlisted soldiers. I keep not spelling soldiers right. I'm sorry. Soldiers and officers. So that means you're accusing the military of saying you're not preparing, you don't have enough resources to make mental health support a priority. What are the current resources that they have, if any? I'm guessing that they do because the writer is saying they don't do enough. But what are their current resources and why aren't they enough? So that's some discussion that's needed for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to move into the first body paragraph, which I'm presuming is going to be based on the organization of the problem solution paper, a further development on the problem itself. So we'll see. Okay, so and we don't need an article there. So during World War II, 291,557 United States soldiers died, and we don't need a comma before while because while is a subordinating conjunction, and you never have a comma before a subordinating conjunction. Died while that number of soldiers died in, and this doesn't get capitalized, just Civil War, died in the Civil War. So it is common belief that the military will never be considered safe. And we don't need any comma here because there's no comma ever before because of the many wars and conflicts. And we want to change the in to before because we don't ever want to end a sentence with a preposition in which they participate. It is a commonly held belief that, comma, to the military, winning a war is more important than losing a few lives of fallen soldiers. The correct safety measures may not always take place in the military to protect the lives of these soldiers because they are viewed as, because I would reinforce the subject here is soldiers, are viewed as property opposed to humans. Okay. When typing in soldier death into Google, several donation pages pop up asking to donate, we need a subject here. So I'm going to say asking one to donate to I'm going to say a cause because we want an indefinite article rather than a definite article, a cause. But, and then this is a place where we need commas around the introductory phrase. But ultimately, once a soldier dies, the cause is lost. And this, I'm just going to fix this to make it both double quotation marks. More needs to be done in the way of safety and precaution, and no commas necessary here, to stop these selfless citizens from losing their lives on the battlefield, comma, because it goes before a coordinating conjunction and an independent clause, and the military seems to be trying to make efforts to do so. Well, that contradicts what your thesis is saying. I think so. So my initial response to, and here I can see that they're going into PTSD, but my initial response to this paragraph is there's nothing about mental health in it. So they talk about soldiers dying, and they provide numbers for this is how many died in World War II versus the Civil War. That this idea of winning is more important than losing a few lives. You know, this idea of soldiers are considered property of the government rather than humans, right? So they're dehumanized, and that I'm thinking of how I might read or add a topic sentence to this paragraph and pepper in the idea, or at least integrate the idea of mental health into here. So what I might say is, I'm just going to take a stab at a and I'm going to hedge this as arguably got two prepositions here. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to make this paragraph part of this idea of mental health. So, because I think that the writer doesn't need to trash this paragraph. So even though this paragraph doesn't have to do explicitly with mental health, they do have ideas in here that are implicitly related to mental health, because they're using this idea of soldiers dying as this idea of the military dehumanizes soldiers, and the ultimate goal is winning. The ultimate goal is not the safety and the mental health and the physical health of these properties of the government, right? The soldiers. So they already have the implicit idea here, so it won't be hard for the writer to integrate the idea of mental health alongside the idea of the deaths of soldiers, to further establish this problem of the military needs to stop, excuse me, dehumanizing soldiers and look at them, if they want to continue to look at them as property for certain reasons, okay, but they at least need to equally look at them as humans, and that includes when you're looking at something as a human rather than as a piece of property, right? You then need to take into consideration their health and well-being. So that's why I added this topic sentence up here, because it's I think it kind of condenses this idea that the writer is getting at, which is the dehumanization of soldiers by the military. And then I said is one of the leading reasons why mental health for and death of soldiers is arguably not subject verb agreement, are arguably not high priorities for the military. And then that kind of leads into this idea of the death idea. And then what I might do down here, like this is all okay. This I might say here, evidence would be helpful here. This idea that it's a commonly held belief. So I don't know that. And I also don't know if it's changed across, say, like we were talking like that last 50 years. So, you know, how we fight wars has changed. So has that changed how, because arguably, and I don't know, but my understanding at least, or maybe I'm just making this up in my head, is that we don't lose as many soldiers now as say we did during the Civil War, because of the nature of fighting, because of the nature of how we fight, where we don't necessarily have to have people, quote unquote, on the front lines. Yes, we do have people on the front lines, so to speak, but we don't have that kind of like Braveheart type of war where two large groups of people are running at each other. If that still happens, I'm not aware of that. Maybe it's happening. And I apologize if I'm ignorant in that way. But this idea that winning a war is more important than losing a few lives. And I would say that these are more than a few lives. So I think that this is a little bit reductive. So I would change this to like losing the lives of fallen soldiers. So, because this is not, I would say a few is like 5, but this is like a lot. This is, getting, 250,000, more than 250,000. So, and then what I would do to also beef up this paragraph is to go back to that idea of mental health. So, and that would happen down here. I think this is the best place because this is kind of after the writer finishes talking about death. So here's where they would want to bring in the idea of mental health. So not only does the military need to start viewing soldiers as humans when it comes to soldiers dying, but also when it comes to the mental health. And I'm going to be repetitive here because this is that good repetition where you're jogging the reader's memory. The mental health of, and I'm just going to go back to the idea of enlisted soldiers and officers. And I don't think this, I don't think this needs to be here. I'm going to turn the track changes on now in case the in case the writer wants to keep it, but I'm going to get rid of it. But this down here, the military seems to be trying to make efforts to do so. It's like you just spent 2 paragraphs saying that the military doesn't do enough, and now you have a sentence that says they're making efforts. So it's not to say that they aren't, but you're just changing your rhetoric here so that it's a little bit confusing for the reader. So what I would say is, why is this here? You're not talking about your opposition here. So that's why it's not rhetorically necessary to put here. This is contradictory to what you are currently doing rhetorically. So that's what I would change there. Okay, so that's the introduction and the first body paragraph. And like I said, I'm just going to kind of breeze over what's left, just to kind of, if I have any notes to give, I will. I just kind of want to look at some topic sentences. Here I can see that, right, like I said before, we can see that the writer is bringing up PTSD, so they're bringing up this idea of the mental disorder and a specific one. And here they're going to be giving more information about this, right? So this seems to be more definition of the problem, to some extent, because the problem is what, at least what the writer is addressing, is that the military does not have sufficient and sustainable resources for current enlisted soldiers and officers in terms of resources for mental health. So if the whole paragraph is about PTSD, my note would be, okay, well, what is the mental health? Like, what are they currently doing about it? Because that's the argument. The argument is not about PTSD. The argument is about the military's resources for the mental health of enlisted soldiers and officers. So this topic sentence here, right, 25% of military members have symptoms of at least one mental health condition, no comma there, with more than 10% qualifying for a diagnosis of 2 or more mental illnesses. And in the APA is where you can use the ampersand. So I'm going to put that there. One major con in joining, that's a little bit colloquial, so I'm going to say drawback instead. In joining the military is the development of extreme mental illnesses, the most common being PTSD. Here's where you want to say this is the first time they mention it, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then PTSD, and then they can refer to it as PTSD for the rest of the time. So then I would get rid of this, and I would get rid of this other parenthesis. Is an anxiety disorder that can provide blah, blah, blah. I don't care what it says. It needs evidence. Evidence for definition. And here's where I would say DSM. That's where you're going to get your primary, most important definition. I don't care what any other sites say unless they're quoting the DSM. You need the definition from the DSM. Regardless of the cause, this disorder can cause, we don't need an article there, veterans of this nation to experience traumatic flashbacks of events. During these episodes, introductory phrase, we need a comma. One may feel that you can just say their life or the lives of others are in extreme danger. He or she may also feel afraid and that they have no control over what is happening. Now here we're getting into a lot of summary of PTSD, and I'm not sure it's necessary. I think a little bit is necessary, but I don't think all of it is. I'm going to recommend that this is not necessary, so I'm going to delete that. In this next sentence, episodes of PTSD have put the general public in harm's way. When an expert in military weaponry goes into crisis and attacks the public. I would keep that because that's a different idea. It's not just summarizing, but I need evidence for that. That's now saying that the PTSD is not just harming the individual, but it's now externalizing to harm other people and the public. So while PTSD is the most common health problem, for veterans, I think. Several other health disorders claim the lives of soldiers every day. We need a comma before the gerund, the ing verb, but not limited to TBI, I don't know what that is, chronic pain, and sleeping disorders. These health issues should all be considered serious and more carefully researched by the Department of Defense. So why are you saying they're not being considered serious? So evidence that they are not considered serious. How is the DoD currently researching mental health issues? So some information there is necessary. I also don't think this is necessary. I'm going to delete that. These types of emotions, you don't even need that. You just need emotions. So I'm going to get rid of this. Disrupt the lives of thousands of veterans daily, resulting in 22 veteran suicides daily. And I think that is that, because it's a citation. That is one every 6 to 5 minutes. I don't know if this is a quotation, so I need to ask that of the student, because they need to make sure that they quote. If it's numbers, that has to be quoted. You can't paraphrase that. Rising suicide rates of soldiers and veterans. Now notice that the writer has moved from just soldiers, enlisted soldiers and officers, to soldiers and veterans, but they didn't talk about veterans at all in their introduction. So I'm going to make a note here that you didn't discuss veterans in your introduction. If you are, you need to include this in the intro. I would say it's in the best interest of the writer to not include that. I might put a caveat in the introduction that says something along the lines of, while veterans also significantly suffer from mental disorders such as blankety blank, this paper will only address enlisted soldiers and officers, period. And that's language for the introduction to let the reader know I'm only going to be, yes, veterans do suffer from this, and that's its own situation and issue. And that has to do with healthcare, with costs, with the VA, with how veterans are treated, how veterans are viewed culturally, and that's a whole other issue. So that's why I'm saying it's in the best interest of the writer to only talk about either enlisted soldiers and officers or veterans, because that's two different topics in terms of what the military has in terms of current resources for enlisted soldiers and officers versus what is available to veterans once they are no longer enlisted. What is available to them? So it's two different types of resources that the student is bringing up in this paragraph, and that's informationally problematic because, one, it wasn't addressed in the introduction, and two, they're not the same thing. So you want to get rid of that information. And now I'm talking directly to the student who should be hopefully listening to this. And then it goes on to continue to talk about suicide, but I'm guessing this has to do with veterans as well. But again, I would either include that conversation, either rhetorically reframe the paper so that it's addressing mental health resources for veterans of the military, or and I'll write this for the student so they have the note written down rather than just listening to me say it multiple times. I'll just use this here. So either rhetorically reframe the paper to focus on mental health resources for veterans, which is provided by the government and the military, but it's provided outside, right? So it's a different resource versus mental health resources for enlisted soldiers and officers. So I said either rhetorically reframe the paper to focus on this thing versus mental health resources for enlisted soldiers and officers, or don't talk about veterans. And here I'm going to add, if the latter, I would add a caveat in the intro that states something like, you know, while veterans also suffer from mental health disorders such as whatever, PTSD, I don't know any others off the top of my head, dissociation, depression, panic attacks, you know, this and this, this paper will only be addressing mental health resources for currently enlisted or active duty, whatever the language is, soldiers and officers. Okay. All right. So, and then the writer goes on. If we go to look at the next paragraph, I see already there's no evidence there, so it makes me a little nervous. But I think I'm going to look down here first. No, this is addressing the opposition. So here it's a little contradictory because they're saying they are making efforts to help with mental health. Well, this works because this is where the student will want to do a little rhetorically reframing as well, because where it sounds contradictory, what they're doing is they're talking about the potential solutions. So that's how you want to frame this. Has been attempting solutions to the problem of X, because now I don't know what the problem is because I've complicated that for the writer, including, because you want this to be a full topic sentence. There are relaxed recruitment efforts in place to bring on qualified mental health personnel. Bringing these professionals on as officers provides incentive to some because of the retirement pensions and job stability. We need evidence for this potential solution. Great efforts and advancements are also being made with unmanned aircraft, and counterintelligence is becoming more and more sophisticated. I'm confused. I think what they're saying is that bringing these professionals on board are also available for those working with unmanned aircraft systems and counterintelligence, but I'm not sure. So I'm just confused about the meaning of that sentence. So that sentence needs clarity. But overall, this paragraph needs evidence to show that that is actually a solution to the problem that the military has been attempting or attempted in the past, at least. And then they go into the best solution to providing more access to mental health care for the enlisted. No, why are you saying that's red? No, it's fine. For the enlisted is to campaign efforts to eliminate the stigma that surrounds seeking mental health support. Okay. This is not just a military problem, but it is a problem. I wouldn't say across the board. That's idiomatic language. I would say it is a problem in almost all I'm just going to say in American culture, because it's a generalization, but there's only so much room in this paper. People questioning their mental health stability are often afraid to seek help because they do not, right, want to be labeled as crazy. The student is really a fan of double quotes and then a single quotation mark, or how their responsibility is reduced. Some fear the side effects of mental health support. Some people, I think we need a subject there, fear the side effects of mental health support medication. What? That needs a little bit of clarity. Some people fear the side effects of mental health support. I think what they're saying, and I could be wrong, is that the mental health industry, what's known as Big Pharm, PHARM, is that if you start seeing a psychiatrist, that this is going to lead to the abuse of pharmacological substances. I think that's what this writer is saying, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to ask that question here. Seeing a psychiatrist leads to the abuse of pharmacological substances. Right? When that becomes a problem, many hide that because they are ashamed that they are military strong, but not strong enough to take control of their addiction. Officers need to be trained to take the lead on spotting enlisted soldiers who are struggling, and we need a comma here, and there needs to be regular psychological testing. We don't need periodically because I've already said regular, of anyone that is responsible for a weapon. I agree. Everyone should be somewhat of a mental health profession. What? Confused. That's going to be my note. Okay. So that's, and then they get into the opposition. And then they have this call to action down here. I might say they want a little bit more robust of a call to action rather than at the end of their rebuttal to the opposition. But that needs to be, I'm going to show the final showing markup because I centered the references there. We don't need these. I'm going to take check changes off for this, but you don't need these extra spaces because the hanging indentation, oops, I need to do that. No, I don't want to open that. There we go. Okay, need a space there. I'm not going to go through the references page. I expect you guys to do that. But that's everything I have to say about the problem solution paper. Like I said, I'm halfway through. I have 7 more problem solution papers to go through. So really all you're doing for this week is waiting for my feedback. 10 of you have already gotten feedback on the problem solution paper, and there are 7 people who are waiting who will get that by tomorrow. And then revise your problem solution draft and submit that by Sunday, and then also complete the final exam. So this is it for my last video lecture. I just want to say it's been, you guys have been a really great class, a really great group of writers, better than my literature class, actually. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and always feel free to stay in touch should you have any questions about writing in the future. But otherwise, look out for some further announcements from me about this week and then about final grades. Okay, bye-bye.